I'm Kelly Andringa at the University of Iowa. We have Roger Wood from InfoEd, and our special guest today is Shawna Sadler from ORCID.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us here today.
Our first interview question for the ERA committee for NCURA would be, how can investigators leverage their ORCID profiles to aid with getting data into ScienceCV?
Sure. Thank you so much. So it's best if researchers can populate their ORCID profile as much as possible. And not only to populate it manually, but in a perfect world, your ORCID ID would be connected to the different systems in the research ecosystem, like publishers and funders and your employer. And then that way the systems can write the data to your ORCID record. And then the researcher is always in control of their ORCID records, so they can delete that data or edit its visibility at any time. So researchers and research administrators can proactively connect the ORCID IDs to some of these. So the first one is Crossref, which provides DOIs from mostly the publishing industry. And so when your ORCID ID is affiliated with a citation and there's a DOI, it will automatically be written to your ORCID record, which is really helpful. We've had a lot of researchers tell us that it was actually ORCID that notified them that their article was published. Publishers aren't always great about that, but they get a notification from ORCID that something's been added to their record. Just heads up, something's been added, and that way they can review it and either decide to delete it if they want or change the visibility. And then we have that same setup with our sister organization DataCite. And so if there's a DOI from DataCite, your data set, and an ORCID ID, that will automatically be written to your ORCID record. Same thing, that way researchers get notified and can change the visibility or delete it if they like. It's best if you can, fill your ORCID record as much as possible. And so that way, when you do log in to ScienceCV with your ORCID ID, all the data in your ORCID record will pre-populate the form. And so that way, as a researcher, you only have to edit the content in your form rather than rekey it and enter it, all the data yourself, which is just a nightmare. And so ORCID, we're really part of that infrastructure. We're kind of like the plumbing of data. And we really help move the data from system to system. And so that way, not only researchers don't have to rekey, but staff don't have to rekey. It's really, we move the data from the source who created that data. It's usually the publishers or the funder or the employer. And then we populate the ORCID record, and then that really gets recycled into the different forms that researchers have to fill out all the time. And so that's part of our, where ORCID helps reduce administrative burden. And then just last, ideally, for researchers in the US, it's ideal for them to link their ORCID ID to their ERA Commons profile. And then that way, again, the data, the ORCID ID will pass on to the different forms in the ScienceCV, and then your data can automatically be transferred that way. So it's a little bit of work at the start, just connecting your ID to the systems, but then it really lets the data flow. You really do connect the pipes and the data flows for you, so you don't have to re-enter it yourself.
Great. And so you previously mentioned something about institutions. So should institutions write employment data to their researchers' records to validate their status as a professional researcher?
Yeah, absolutely. It's imperative. I think one thing that's fundamentally different about ORCID to other profile systems, let's say like Google Scholar, is that the ORCID record is created and managed by the researcher themselves. Whereas Google Scholar, it's done for the researcher, but the researcher, it would be really difficult to get any changes made to your Google Scholar record. Whereas with ORCID, it's a login and the researcher's in full control. And so one of the downsides to that is that anybody can create an ORCID record, an ORCID profile. To qualify for an ORCID ID, you need to be a human being over the age of 18. But how do you differentiate yourself as a professional researcher to a citizen scientist, right, who may have your same name? And it's really when the employers, the funders, and the publishers start writing data to your ORCID profile that starts to show that you are a professional researcher, particularly if the employer writes your employment, the basic employment data to your ORCID record that's public anyway. And then the source of that data is the university. So there's a big difference between someone claiming to be, you know, somebody who works at Harvard University as a professional researcher in the Harvard Business School or medical school or law, versus somebody, you know, versus Harvard saying, yes, this is one of our people, writes the employment data, and the source of that data is Harvard. So that's a big difference. You know, I've heard, you know, somebody at Stanford University say that it bolsters their profile as a researcher. And I think that's really important. So one is the credibility, but also bolstering, because, you know, we have heard from some funding agencies, you know, when their reviewers review an application for funding, you know, not always, but they'll often look at the ORCID profile of that researcher to get a sense of who they are. Are they a professional researcher? You know, who is this person? Are they a professional? Who employs them? How have they written? Who are they writing with? Who else have they received funding from? And so when you have a complete profile, it really does help shape your research profile, your professionalism as a researcher, to help give you that sense. So employers could really help their researchers by helping them populate as much data in their records as possible, and employment is critical. But you know, some universities are also helping their researchers with other data elements like their funding and their works, which is really helpful. So, because you know what, our researchers should be spending their time doing the research, not the administration. You know, so we can be a big part of that and be really helpful. We can really help out.
So will ORCID be able to help the data for current and pending and other support requirements that agencies, federal agencies and other agencies are requesting from Science CV?
That's what we understand. So with the information we know so far, you know, the NSF was great in responding to the NSPM 33 memo, and they did, with their initial response, they included a spreadsheet with the data components, and most of the data that they listed can be populated from an ORCID record. So specifically employment, invited positions, funding, and it's an area we call research resources. That's a broad term. Research instruments, research labs that, you know, they can write to ORCID records. So just as a quick example, if your university has a supercomputer that researchers apply to use, in that application, they can include their ORCID ID, and when they're awarded time on that, using that research instrument, that award can be written to their ORCID record to say, you know, yes, you know, this person did receive time using this research instrument. And, you know, some of those research instruments are getting their own unique identifiers, which is really handy data, because if you want to start aggregating data and to analyze it, you know, if you were that manager of that supercomputer, you could collect all the ORCID IDs of researchers that have used your facility, and then you could collect all the affiliated grants that were used to use this facility and all the publications. And I think with that data set, you could really make a case to your stakeholders of, you know, why the university should have this facility, and look at the impact that it had, and the researchers, and probably you can note the collaborations that it enabled. And I think the stakeholders who support that lab would really appreciate that kind of data. So, so sorry, just to go back to current and pending and other support. Yes, ORCID will be able to pre-populate a lot of that. So for universities to help their researchers populate that data, you know, with good data too. You know, some researchers, they're like the employment field. A lot of researchers have an affiliation. They feel they identify usually more at the lab department level, sometimes the faculty level. And then when they submit their applications for funding or publications, that data is often fixed by the funder or the publisher so that it's at the university level, you know, the top level, not down. So I think it would be ideal if universities could write the accurate top level data that includes the university's identifier provided by ROAR. That's again one of our sister organizations. And so that way the data, the employment data in the record is accurate and correct, and really best. So that way the funders and publishers don't have to fix it later. And who knows if they fix it correctly, because some universities have the same name too, right? There's 2 universities in New England. There's one in Massachusetts, there's another in Australia. There's 4 Concordia universities that I know of. There's 2 in the US, 2 in Canada, right? Which Concordia are you with? Did the funder or publisher get that right? because this data will be attributed to the university, and it does help with your research, with your impact rankings. You know, the data is flying around. So you want to make sure that the university gets its data correct. And a really easy way to do that is to populate the research, the employment section of the researcher's records.
So back to institutions getting some of their own credit, I guess. Can institutions push funding data into the ORCID profiles? And I guess we talked about this a little bit, to assist the investigators getting their data to Science CV. And again, that's for the current and pending documents.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are seeing that. And I think there's one thing I should just maybe clarify. So I think it's absolutely incredible. It's fantastic that universities are writing the funding data to ORCID records. That's wonderful. And I think where we should clarify is, you know, we've got some funding agencies that are coming online and writing funding data to ORCID records as well. So right now it's usually UKRI and Wellcome Trust are doing this. And Wellcome Trust did a project. They also wrote retrospectively all the funding data that they've awarded in the past to ORCID records. So if this were to happen to one of your researchers at your university, where the university wrote the funding and then that funder eventually wrote that funding as well to the ORCID record, so it'd be like a duplication, I just want to make sure everybody knows that ORCID, we have this figured out because it happens a lot in the work section. There's a lot of sources for the same citation. So what we do in both these situations is that we group them and we stack them. And it's really based on the unique ID of that object. So funding will get a unique ID, sometimes affiliated by the funder. And if that's written in the citation, then we will group them. And then when they're grouped, it's the researcher that can decide which one they want to display first. And it's usually based on the source of the data, or maybe the quality of the metadata that they want to go into the Science CV, whichever one they want to go forward. So the source of the data would show as the university, and then if the funder eventually does write that same citation, the source of that will be the funder, and the researcher can decide which data they want to prioritize and then use to recycle into the different forms.
Okay, so just to
go ahead
to restate that. So what you're saying is that if there's something that's duplicated, it'll kind of appear in that same format, so the researcher can pick one or the other.
Yep.
Okay, that's cool.
Yep. So universities, please write the funding to the ORCID record of your researchers. It'll help everybody. And if the funder finally does it themselves, we can handle it. No problem.
Also worth noting is the distinction between pending and awarded. So funders will, over time, add awarded data. They're less likely to add pending data. Certainly the US federal government considers that not to be public information. So the source for that will probably continue to be universities.
Great. Yeah. I think that was all of our questions today, Shawna. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully this has been informative for the NCURA membership. Thank you.
Anytime, and feel free to reach out. It's no trouble at all.